හරිම සුමුදුයි.
Tonight on First at 9 this Friday the 19th of January 2024. Recovering. Sri Lanka showing signs of recovery, says the visiting IMF mission.
The economic reform program implemented by the Sri Lankan authorities is yielding the first signs of recovery.
Highlights the need for good governance for growth.
In order for the full recovery to take place, good governance also has to ensure
If you see something, say something.
Immediate attention. In an exclusive interview, the IMF mission chief expects Sri Lanka's debt issues to be solved within the next few months.
We would like these debt issues to be resolved in the next 2 months or so that there aren't any complications by the time this goes to the executive board.
Reveals how debt restructuring helps boost investor confidence.
You lose confidence very quickly and you rebuild it very, very slowly. So bringing your debt on a sustainable footing is a very, very important part of that.
Reinvention. President Ranil Wickremesinghe calls for a strong non-aligned movement. Urges reinvention to contribute to a better world. Bard. CB interdicts 15 employees for disrupting services during a protest in early January.
ඔබේ විශ්වාසය දෙනු සෙන්සුරයින් දැන් ළඟමැති ෆාමසියෙන් ලබාගත හැක.
This is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
Good evening and welcome to AdaDerana First at 9. I'm Aditya Drisingha joining you live with the latest in Sri Lanka and around the world. Now in your top story tonight, the visiting IMF team in Sri Lanka to review the progress of the Extended Fund Facility Program commended Sri Lanka's reform implementation, adding that the program has started to yield the first signs of economic recovery. While highlighting the need on the timely implementation of reforms at a media briefing to conclude the visit, the IMF Senior Mission Chief for Sri Lanka, Peter Brewer, says Sri Lanka has to introduce a progressive property or wealth tax in order to ensure fair distribution of the tax burden within the country. Further, the IMF also called on the government to ensure good governance to resurrect the country and achieve higher levels of economic growth.
The economic reform program implemented by the Sri Lankan authorities is yielding the first signs of recovery. Real GDP recorded positive growth of 1.6% year on year in the third quarter of 2023, which is the first expansion in 6 consecutive quarters. Shortages of essentials have eased and inflation remains contained. Gross international reserves increased by $2.5 billion during 2023, and preliminary data point to improved fiscal revenue collections during the fourth quarter of 2023. However, challenges remain as these improvements need to translate into improved living conditions for Sri Lanka's people. In this context, sustaining the reform momentum and ensuring timely implementation of all program commitments are critical to rebuilding confidence and putting the recovery on a firm footing that will benefit all people. Swift progress towards the introduction of a progressive property tax is key to ensuring fair burden sharing while sustaining the revenue-based consolidation. Tax policy measures need to be accompanied by strengthening tax administration, removing tax exemptions, and actively eliminating tax evasion to make reforms more sustainable and to further build confidence among Sri Lanka's creditors to regain debt sustainability. Following the publication of the IMF Governance Diagnostic Report, it is now imperative for the authorities to adopt their own action plan for implementing the recommendations in the report beyond the priority commitments under the EFF arrangement. Progress in meeting key commitments under the IMF-supported program will be formally assessed in the context of the second review of the EFF arrangement alongside the forthcoming 2024 for Article 4 consultation, which will assess Sri Lanka's economic health.
What is your assessment of the debt restructuring progress? Is it evolving as fast as you would like?
Now what needs to be done is to finalize these agreements in principle, or rather to convert them into actual agreements with the official creditors so as to complete that portion of the debt restructuring. And secondly, reach agreements in principle with the commercial creditors, where the bondholders are, of course, a significant proportion. So our understanding is that negotiations are ongoing, proposals are being exchanged, and it is important for that process to continue and be completed as quickly as possible. It's our strong expectation that there would be an agreement in principle by the time of the second review.
How satisfied are you about the tax administration measures that have been taken up to now?
Tax administration is very important. So, meaning the ability of the country to collect the taxes that it needs in order to sustain its essential expenditures. And it is important for those who owe taxes to make these payments and to address any efforts of tax evasion, because it basically means any rupee that in taxes that is due but not paid means that everybody else has to pay more. And it's a significant reform in Sri Lanka to get back to the level of tax collection that Sri Lanka was at some time ago. And so it's important that everyone make their fair contribution to this effort. Our understanding is that these reforms with respect to the large taxpayer unit, the various institutional reforms inside that unit are well underway in order to support the tax collection efforts in Sri Lanka.
After 6 consecutive quarters of contraction, we finally do see a positive growth. Now, this positive growth has not filtered through all segments of the country, so there are many people who still do feel hardship, but we do see that program beginning to work. And so we believe that if Sri Lanka can persevere a bit more, hold on to the reform agenda, then this nascent growth that we are beginning to see can actually turn into a full recovery, which will then be felt by all of Sri Lankans. I would also like to highlight governance in general is important to get Sri Lanka out of this crisis and into a full-fledged recovery. And we also would like to highlight that in order for the full recovery to take place, good governance also has to ensure that there is an enabling environment for all of Sri Lankans to come together and ensure that people can hold others accountable when we see that the policies that were meant for all Sri Lankans are not being implemented correctly.
The environment in which reforms take place is very important to the success of the reforms. Having an enabling environment in which governance and transparency reforms can take place is very important. If you see something, say something. Only if everyone works together to eliminate corruption and bribery will it actually work.
Now, meanwhile, in an exclusive interview on at Hyde Park with Indivari Amuwatta, IMF Senior Mission Chief for Sri Lanka, Peter Brewer, says the global lender expects the debt issues of Sri Lanka to be solved within the next 2 months to ensure that there are no complications when the second review of the IMF's extended fund facility is conducted by its executive board. Commenting on the restructuring of state-owned enterprises, meanwhile, IMF resident representative in Sri Lanka, Dr. Sawat Jahan, says most of the SOEs out of the 52 identified have published their balance sheets, for which audits will take place in the future.
Where is Sri Lanka right now in terms of debt restructuring? So what should Sri Lanka be aware of, be careful of, and how should Sri Lanka go about this?
Debt restructuring in Sri Lanka is actually one of the more complicated ones in recent history, because all aspects of debt matter in this. Yet Sri Lanka has actually been able to move relatively quickly in comparison to recent history. Of course, we think it could still go faster, but realistically speaking, it's been moving along relatively quickly. So we would like these debt issues to be resolved in the next 2 months or so that there aren't any complications by the time this goes to the executive board. So we will come back here for the review mission, and then there's a bit of a process before it goes to the board.
How important is this debt restructuring process, especially for Sri Lanka's investor confidence on Sri Lanka and moving forward in terms of building Sri Lanka's image for creditors and ensuring that these hard-earned gains are strengthened and are retained?
You lose confidence very quickly and you rebuild it very, very slowly. So bringing your debt on a sustainable footing is a very, very important part of that. And in fact, so you don't only want to regain the confidence of new investors to bring capital to Sri Lanka, you also want to rebuild confidence of the current creditors who are being asked to provide debt relief. So a second important component of the debt restructuring that Sri Lanka still needs to achieve is the restructuring of the external bonds that are held primarily externally but also domestically. And here progress is still needed. That needs to move quickly so that in fact that portion of the debt can be put on a sustainable footing ahead of the second IMF review. And these reforms that we spoke about earlier, the fiscal reforms, are an important part of rebuilding confidence both with these creditors because they want to convince themselves that in fact Sri Lanka's efforts merit the debt relief that they are being asked to provide, because debt relief means somebody's savings somewhere will be diminished by the amount of debt relief that's being provided to Sri Lanka.
How does the IMF review the progress Sri Lanka has made so far in terms of looking at the restructuring of state-owned enterprises?
As a part of the program, we had some structural benchmarks on SOEs. One of the first ones that we looked into was actually cost recovery for fuel and energy pricing, because when you get cost recovery, that means you don't have to tax the people to make up for the losses. That was one of the first reforms that we looked into. We had also asked the authorities to come up with a strategy for the restructuring of the balance sheets of 4 major SOEs, and those 4 major SOEs was Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, Ceylon Electricity Board, Sri Lanka Airlines, and Road Development Authority. And indeed, the authorities did meet that benchmark. They did come up with a restructuring strategy of the balance sheets, and some of these measures have already been taken place. So what that means is that these SOEs had legacy debt that needed to be addressed, because when you have a huge debt on your balance sheets, you do not really get financing for other types of projects which could have been profitable. So these are some of the measures that Sri Lankan authorities have already undertaken. We also called for transparency, and along those lines, what we had asked is that major SOEs in Sri Lanka publish their audited reports on a government website. And we're happy to say that most of the SOEs, we had identified 52, so most of these SOEs have indeed produced their financial reports. A few still need to be audited. So I think they are on the right track.
Now, following more news on the IMF mission here in Sri Lanka, opposition leader Sajith Premadasa informed IMF representatives that his party is expecting to amend the existing agreement with the IMF to better address the pressing concerns affecting all Sri Lankans while working towards reviving the country under a SJB-led government. The opposition leader further revealed that the SJB has put together an official plan to successfully execute those intended reforms. He went on to say that the present government has arbitrarily increased taxes, including the VAT, passing on a significant burden to the people of Sri Lanka.
Opposition leader Sajith Premadasa met with the IMF representatives who are currently on an official visit to the island. Senior Mission Chief for Sri Lanka Peter Brewer, IMF resident representative in Sri Lanka Sarwat Jahan, as well as IMF economist Manavi Abevikrama attended the meeting, which was held at the opposition leader's office yesterday. During the meeting, opposition leader Sajith Premadasa highlighted that he expects to amend the agreement with the IMF under Samaga Jana Balavegiya-led government to better address the concerns of all Sri Lankans. The opposition leader revealed that the SJB has an official plan to execute that initiative. Opposition leader Sajith Premadasa stressed that the present government has arbitrarily increased taxes, including the value-added tax, claiming that it has been done so under the directives of the IMF. He added that those steps have passed a heavy tax burden on the people of Sri Lanka. Highlighting those concerns, opposition leader Sajith Premadasa went on to inform the IMF that while continuing the initiatives already embarked upon, the SJB will work towards the betterment of people and revive the country after securing power. In the meantime, a discussion between the IMF representatives and members of the National People's Power was also held at the NPP headquarters yesterday.
Now, in other news, President Ranil Wickremesinghe emphasized that issues such as the digital divide and weapons of mass destruction have deepened inequalities between the developing nations of the world, of the non-aligned movement, as well as the developing world at large. Addressing the 19th summit of the non-aligned movement, President Wickremesinghe stressed on the importance of a strong and united non-aligned movement in order to address those issues, and also urged reinvention to contribute to a better world.
President Ranil Wickremesinghe, on the invitation of Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni, arrived at Kampala, Uganda yesterday to participate in the 19th summit of the Non-Aligned Movement. The summit under the theme Deepening Cooperation for Shared Global Affluence commenced today. The president arrived in Uganda following his visit to Switzerland to take part in the 54th annual meeting of the World Economic Forum. Addressing the 19th summit of the Non-Aligned Movement in Kampala, President Ranil Wickremesinghe highlighted how the digital divide and weapons of mass destruction have deepened inequalities between developing states of the Non-Aligned Movement and the developing world at large. The President's office reported that underscoring the urgency to address these issues, President Wickremesinghe emphasized the need for a strong, united non-aligned movement and urged reinvention to contribute to a better world. During President Wickremesinghe's visit to Kampala, he is slated to engage in discussions with counterparts from the Global South, with an emphasis on strengthening ties with leaders from the African region.
Now in more local news, disciplinary action was taken against 15 employees of the Ceylon Electricity Board who were engaged in a series of protests along with several other CEB employees. The series of protests were launched earlier this month objecting to the restructuring of the Ceylon Electricity Board as well as the new Electricity Act. The 15 employees of the CEB against whom the disciplinary action was taken reportedly disrupted services during their protest and inconvenienced several customers.
Earlier this month, members of the Ceylon Electricity Board Trade Union engaged in a series of protests for 3 days from the 3rd of January to the 5th, expressing their objection to the restructuring of CEB and against the new electricity bill. The series of protests and strike actions came off the back of a CEB management decision to cancel leave of all CEB employees. Further, electricity-related services were designated as essential services through a Gazette notification issued on directives of President Ranil Wickremesinghe. However, CEB employees disregarding the circular and the Gazette notification continued to protest. Taking the situation into consideration, Minister of Power and Energy Kanchana Wijesekara advised the CEB management to suspend certain employees and take appropriate disciplinary action against employees disrupting services or acting in violation of guidelines. Subsequently, the CEB revealed that 15 employees of the entity were interdicted for disrupting services during their protest. The CEB further revealed that the employees in question, who are clerical staff members in charge of the cash counters, had obstructed and inconvenienced customers who had come to pay their bills by closing off the counters.
Now, while speaking with the Chief Prelate of the Malwatu Chapter, Most Venerable Tibbatuavi Sri Sumangala Thera, leader of the National People's Power, Anukumara Disanayaka, revealed that they expect the election to be held between the 18th of September and the 17th of October this year. Meanwhile, SJB MP Dr. Rajitha Senaratne claims that he would wholeheartedly support President Ranil Wickremesinghe if he decides to abolish the executive presidency, even if it means that the incumbent president remains in office for 2 more years. Now with that, let's take a look at some views exchanged in the political arena today.
දැන් කට්ටිය කියනනේ රට බේර ගන්නවා රට රැක ගන්නවා ඩොලර් ගේනවා රුපියල් ගේනවා මොන ගේනවද ඔක්කොම කයිවාරු කවුරු හරි ඉදිරිපත් වෙනවා නම් වර්තමාන රජයට විකල්පය හැටියට විපක්ෂයේ ඉඳගෙනම වැඩ පෙන්නන්න.
Meanwhile, leader of the National People's Power, Anukumara Disanayaka, today called on the chief prelates of the Malwatu and Askiri chapters and sought blessings. Firstly, NPP leader Anukumara Disanayaka visited the chief prelate of the Malwatu chapter, Most Venerable Tibbatuavi Sri Sumangala Thera, at the Malwatu Mahavihara.
ඒගොල්ලෝ ඉතින් අපිට විරුද්ධව එකතු වෙන්න පුළුවන් ඔක්කොම එකතු වෙවි තියෙනවා. මොනවාද ලොකුනම් තියෙනවා පොඩක් ප්‍රතිචාර හොඳයි.
Subsequently, leader of the NPP Anukumara Disanayaka called on the chief prelate of the Askiri chapter, Most Venerable Varakagoda Sri ஞானரத்ன Thera, at the Askiri Mahavihara to receive blessings.
සැප්තැම්බර් 17 ඔක්තෝබර් 17 වගේ මාස ඇතුළත ජනාධිපති කියලා පිළිතනවා. අපේක්ෂාව ඉතින් වෙනසක් ඇති කර ගැනීම සඳහා තමයි.
ඔට්ටුවේ එමෙතුරු ඉපදෙනින්ම රනිල් ජනාධිපතිතුමාට සහයෝගය දෙන්න ඊයේ ප්‍රකාශ කරා.
ඒගොල්ලෝ රනිල්ට සහාය දෙනවා කියලා කිව්වද? රනිල් වික්‍රමසිංහත් ඔය නඩයත් මේ රට මේ විපතටපත් කරපු කණ්ඩායම. පිනා chance එකකින් මේ පුටුවේ වාඩි වුණාට පස්සේ දැන් එයා ඇරියස් කවර් කරනවා. තංචර 18ක් ගිහලා තියෙනවා. තුමා චුට්ටක් ජනාධිපති ධූරයේ විඳිනවා මේ දවස්වල කියලා තමයි අපිට පේන්නේ.
සමග ජන බලවේගයේ IMF එක හම්බුණා. අපි ඍජුව පැහැදිලිව කිව්වා ඒගොල්ලන්ට අපි මේ IMF කිවිසුම ඉදිරි රජයකදී වෙනස් කරනවා. දැන් මම දැක්කා ජනතා විමුක්ති පෙරමුණ කාර්යාලයට ගිහිල්ලා තියෙනවා IMF එක. අනුර කුමාර හම්බෙලා නැහැ.
කතා කරේ මොනවද කියලා ඉවරලා මාධ්‍යයට නිකුත් කරන්නේ නැහැ. විකල්ප බලවේග රටේ ජනතාවට කියන්න ඕන මේ රටේ ආර්ථිකය හදලා ජනතාවට සහන ලබා දෙන ක්‍රමය මොකක්ද කියන එක කියන්න එපා. කටවුල් කර කර බොරු කිය ඉඳලා හරියන්නේ නැහැ නේ.
අවසානයේ මෙහෙම ගිහිල්ලා සජ්ජප කණ්ඩායමට සජිත් ප්‍රේමදාසට සමාජයට රනිල් වික්‍රමසිංහට උදව් කරන්න සිද්ධ වේවි. ඒක ඉතින් ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ ප්‍රශ්නයක්. රනිල් වික්‍රමසිංහ කිසි දවසක පොදු අපේක්ෂකෙක් වෙන්නේ නැහැ. ඌට විය හැකි දේ තමයි UNP එකේ සහ පොට්ටු හවුලේ අපේක්ෂකයා වෙන්න පුළුවන්. ඒකට පොදු අපේක්ෂකයා කියන්න බෑනේ.
එහෙනම් අපේම දාන්න ඕන කියලා එකක් නැහැ. රට කරවන්නේ මිනිස්සෙක් ඕනේ. රට කරවන්න හොඳ මිනිස්සෙක් දාන්න. මමත් කියනවා රනිල් වික්‍රමසිංහ මහත්තයා මේ යම් මට්ටමකට රට ගොඩ ගත්ත නායකයා. එතුමා ජනාධිපතිතුමා ඔබතුමාලා එතුමාට සහාය දෙනවද?
අද රාජපක්ෂ හිතවාදීන්ට රාජපක්ෂලට නායකයෙක් නැහැ. ඒ නායකයා ඒගොල්ලෝ බලන රනිල් වික්‍රමසිංහ බවට පරිවර්තනය කරන්න.
ජනාධිපති ක්‍රමය අවෝසි කරන්නේ කවුරු වුණත් කමන්නේ අපිට ඒක අවෝසි කරනවා. ඒකට කොන්දේසි නැහැ. මේකෙන් තමයි මේ රට විනාශ වුනේ මතකද? හෙට රනිල් වික්‍රමසිංහ කරනවා නම් මං අත් දෙක මුසනවා. මේ විධායක ජනාධිපති ක්‍රමය කියලා. තව අවුරුදු දෙකක් හිටියක් කමන්නේ මේ කාලකන්නේ මේ ක්‍රමය විනාශ කරනවා.
Now, 3 suspects were arrested along with the consignment of cannabis worth 60 million rupees in Yala during a joint operation launched by the Sri Lanka Army and the police. Meanwhile, a suspect was arrested for feeding toxic food to over 100 birds of several species in Bibile. With that, let's take a look at some news across the island in brief.
Late last Wednesday, the remains of a 9-year-old boy who was snatched by a crocodile were discovered. This unfortunate incident took place when the 9-year-old boy, along with his brother and grandmother, went for a bath in the Kalani River in Kaduwela. The remains of the deceased child were brought to his residence in Kaduwela last night. In the meantime, acting on a tip-off, the Sri Lanka Army and the Gonagannara police conducted a raid at the Yala National Park. During the raid, 1,570 kilograms of cannabis prepared for sale and a firearm were seized, while 3 individuals were arrested. It was reported that the seized cannabis is valued at 60 million rupees. In Hanwala, meanwhile, 2 individuals on a motorcycle who attempted to steal a woman's gold necklace were handed over to the police by residents of the area. Residents had thrown a helmet at the motorcyclists while they were attempting to flee, toppling the vehicle. In other news, an individual who had fed food infused with poison to over 100 birds in Bibile, Kanulwela was taken into police custody and handed over to the wildlife officials for onward legal action. The suspect in question had fed toxic food to several species of birds, including peacocks and pigeons.
Welcome back. Now in your business news, the Colombo Stock Exchange closed in red for the 9th consecutive session today, dragged by losses in consumer staples and healthcare stocks. The Colombo Stock Exchange all-share price index dropped 0.3% to end at 10,432.85 points. For the week, the index fell 1.7%, extending losses to a second consecutive week. Ceylon Tobacco Company and Distilleries Company of Sri Lanka were the top losers on the index, falling 2% and 1.9% respectively. Trading volume on the ASPI rose to 22.4 million shares from 21.8 million shares in the previous session. The S&P Sri Lanka 20 meanwhile dropped by 0.23% to settle at 2,950.32 points. The equity market's turnover rose to 518.7 million rupees from 494.1 million rupees in the previous session. Energy sector was the top contributor to the market turnover, while the capital goods sector was the second highest contributor. Foreign investors were net sellers of loading stocks worth 114.1 million rupees, while domestic investors were net buyers purchasing shares worth 490.2 million rupees. Now let's take a look at how the rupee exchange rates changed during the day. Now in your latest corporate developments, AIA Insurance announced its 2024 partnership distribution business launch under the theme Shift 24, showcasing the entity's dynamic evolution in the bank assurance industry. Ceylon Bank meanwhile announced the introduction of the solar loan facility to ease the burden of rising electricity charges on all Sri Lankans. With that, let's take a look into our corporate news segment for the evening.
AIA Insurance announced its 2024 partnership distribution business launch under the theme Shift 24. Paving its way towards 2 decades of collaborative success, the event showcased AIA's dynamic evolution in the bancassurance industry. AIA has been working closely with leading banks including the long-standing partners NDB and DFCC. Meanwhile, last year, AIA Insurance also secured an exclusive partnership with the commercial bank, further expanding its footprint in the country's financial landscape. Ceylon Bank meanwhile introduced a solar loan facility in a bid to address the challenge of rising electricity costs. In response to the pressing need for sustainable and cost-effective energy solutions, Ceylon Bank's solar loan facility will help its customers achieve financial independence and make sustainable choices for their energy needs. The newly introduced loan facility offers the opportunity to pay a fixed installment over a period of time, ultimately leading to a lifetime of free electricity, as power generation via the unit will be considered as income to offset the electricity bill. In the meantime, Classic Destinations announced a strategic alliance with Sri Lankan Holidays, aiming to elevate the travel experience to unparalleled heights, blending years of expertise and renewed passion to create expeditions that resonate with the modern traveller. Through this partnership, travellers can explore unique bespoke excursions, focusing on the richness of cultural and experiential products, enveloped in an exceptional level of personal service. These offerings encompass tailor-made holidays, cultural experiences, gastronomic delights, and specialized golf tours, offering a comprehensive service under one umbrella.
And with that, we wrap up tonight's edition of AdaDerana First at 9. Stay in touch with us on www.adaderana.lk for the latest developments around the clock. Thank you. Have a great night.
For news and information you can trust 24 hours a day, visit AdaDerana.lk.